Good morning, Harlan. It's great to be with you. We're continuing our series called From Ruin to Restoration because I think that this pandemic for a lot of people has either slowed, it's stopped, maybe even ruined some of the plans in your life, and maybe even it's ruined what you would say parts of your life. And so, really, in this series, we've been asking the question, is it possible to go from ruin to restoration? And in this series, we've been looking at the book of Nehemiah because God used him to bring restoration to a broken people by repairing that broken exterior wall and the gates between the walls. And we know that as he repaired the wall, it was God repairing broken hearts. And so we've been talking about this for the past couple of weeks. And today's theme is this: the road to building or rebuilding is paved with inconvenient commitment. Now, oftentimes, the greatest tasks in your life or the most important things that you need to do not require you to make a 100% sacrifice. That is not to say that you shouldn't give your all to some things, but I'm not sure it's possible to give your all to everything all the time. It's usually a consistent commitment over time that leads to success and achievement. So when you hear statements like, give it your all, well, it's a great sentiment, and sure, there are circumstances where you need to do that, but most of life does not consist of 100% decisions. And so when you hear the phrase "give it your all," it can be a misleading statement and potentially even unhealthy. For example, your children cannot handle 100% of you. You are a parent 100%, but the amount of time you spend with them, they have phrases in this day and age called helicopter parents or lawnmower parents, because you're just so overbearing. The truth is your children need space. And it's something I learned with our kids. We have a girl, a boy, and two more girls. And, when I spend time with them, I don't take all the time I would have spent with them in a year and cram it into one event. That's overkill. So really what I do is I just take time once a week at some point just to spend 20, 30 minutes with them, just me and them. And we make it a bit of a habit. Your children don't need absentee parenting with moments of overkill. And you know this, and your parents or your children have probably told you. What they need is consistent, stable commitment. In fact, if you're a student, most, if not all teachers will tell you, do not cram before an exam. Do your homework every single day. Go over the lecture every single day. Study a little bit every day. Of course, there's a place for heightened study, but those times of heightened study are exponentially more effective if you've made the inconvenient decision to study a little bit every single day, because it's the faithfulness in the small decisions that lay the foundation for larger dreams, larger projects, and larger visions. In fact, every time you put small decisions aside, you are taking a piece out of a larger project, a larger dream, a larger vision. Now, even as I say this, the obvious question is, are there small decisions that you've been putting off because they're, inconvenient? And you know the problem, I do too. The problem with inconvenient decisions is that they're inconvenient. And I think sometimes the same can apply to our faith. I came across an article a couple of days ago entitled, "Have We Turned Christianity into a Religion of Convenience?" Now, one of the effects of COVID-19 that it's had on our culture, particularly our culture of faith, and I'm not immune to this, but it has made faith, just made it it's harder actually. It's more inconvenient. It's just harder, isn't it, to go to church? It's just harder to pray. It's just harder to believe, let alone share your faith. And I think that the real tragedy of all this is that the road to rebuilding or building, the road to restoration, the road to what we would call revival, God just moving and people embracing his love and mercy and grace, is usually paved with a consistent, inconvenient commitment over time. And even in this text and the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the road to rebuilding Jerusalem was not paved with people making the ultimate sacrifice. It was ordinary people who embraced becoming significantly inconvenienced for a greater good. Now, this chapter we're about to read is an interesting chapter. It's interesting because I think for some people, it wouldn't be very interesting. It's about 32 verses, and the vast majority of those verses just name the different people who rebuilt different sections of the wall. In this chapter, there is very little apparent plot advancement, but in reality, it names people who realized that the road to rebuilding was paved with inconvenient commitment, which they gladly made. And so we're just going to read a few verses out of chapter 3, and then we're going to read one verse out of chapter 4, because this verse in chapter 4 does a great job of summarizing what chapter 3 is all about. This is Nehemiah chapter 3, starting in verse 3. The fish gate was built by the sons of Hassenaah. They laid its beams and put its doors and bolts and bars in place. Now, of the 32 verses, this is essentially what 28 to 29 of these verses say. It wasn't people making the ultimate sacrifice, but regular people who did their little part for the sake of a greater good. And I showed you this picture last week. It's kind of it's a clay rendition here, but this is essentially what Jerusalem would have looked like in Nehemiah's day. And so I don't know which is the fish gate, but these gates were destroyed and large chunks of these walls were destroyed. And so they committed to rebuilding different parts of the wall and the gates, but not everyone helped. Verse 5 says the next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa. If you're familiar with a prophet in the Bible named Amos, he is from Tekoa. But their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. Now, we're not given a reason why. We're just told, and now it's forever recorded, that as they rebuilt the walls, as they rebuilt their city, as they rebuilt their home, these nobles refused to help. And maybe it was too much of an inconvenience for them. Maybe they didn't want to dirty their hands. Maybe they had better things to do. Whatever their reasons were, they decided not to support the work. And what's interesting is the contrast. These nobles who have wealth, who have affluence, are not helping. And then when you read in verse 8, Uzziel, son of Hariah, one of the goldsmiths, not one of the construction workers, not one of the contractors, not one of the people who knew how to work with wood and things of that nature. The goldsmiths repaired the next section, and Hananiah, one of the perfume makers, made repairs next to that. These are not construction workers. Their trade had little or nothing to do with rebuilding broken walls. It was people like this who didn't do everything, but they decided to do something despite the personal cost in that moment, and it added up. And they worked so hard that in summation of this entire chapter, chapter 4, verse 6 says this: so we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height. So they weren't quite done yet. For the people worked with all their heart. Now, all their heart didn't necessarily mean all their time or all their lives, even all their resources. In fact, we know from previous chapters that much of the resources were donated. And so it wasn't everything. All their heart really meant giving their all towards their specific limited commitment, because they, to some degree, understood that the road to rebuilding or building even in our lives was and is paved with inconvenient commitment. Now, I'm a big believer in 100% commitment when it comes to people, family, your spouse, your kids. But life doesn't consist of 100% commitments. It's little decisions every single day. Your life, your friendships, your marriage, your children, your grandchildren do not need an infusion of an overkill investment. They need a consistent commitment, even if at times that commitment is inconvenient. And there's a couple of interesting things about commitment in this text. And this is one that might be a little hard to believe, but commitment is usually more impactful than talent. When I first started playing soccer, we had two players on our team who were all-stars. I mean, they were big and they were fast. And whenever you pass them the ball, you could, reasonably rely on them to get a goal. But they decided that they would go play for another team. And when they left, we just thought we were doomed. We thought there is no possible way that we could ever win a game again. And so our coach in response said, I want you to commit to coming to practices. I want you to commit to coming to a second practice, even practice after games, and even practicing on our own time. And long story short, after all this extra commitment, which we still had time to live our own personal lives, but after we were consistent in this commitment, we actually went on to win quite a bit. And I learned something about commitment, and really even about coaching, that a coach can do more with committed people who show up than with talented people who don't. Because commitment is usually more impactful than talent. And by show up, I mean show up with all your heart. And it's a principle that applies to just about every area of your life. You don't have to be, the best parent or the best grandparent. You just have to be a present parent. You don't have to be the best spouse, but you have to be an emotionally present spouse because, and I think maybe we've even experienced this, most people problems have less to do with talent or lack thereof, and more to do with heart or lack thereof. When you look at your most painful and most challenging problems, whether they're people problems or team problems or project problems, which I think in a lot of ways are all just people problems, but when you really examine them, is the solution more talent or is it more heart? And by heart, I mean commitment. Is the challenge, is the problem a lack of talent or a lack of commitment? In this text, it wasn't so much talent that won the day. Next was Uzziel, son of Hariah, a goldsmith by trade. Someone who didn't typically work with wooden posts and things of that nature, who also worked on the wall. Beyond him was Hananiah, a manufacturer of perfumes. I don't know much about concrete and bricklaying, but I don't think, to make the solution sticky and strong, perfume is going to help. These are not trades that lend themselves towards construction. Talent didn't rebuild this wall. God didn't need their talent. God asked for a commitment through Nehemiah. And what God did was that he used a multitude of inconvenient commitments to do the impossible. He doesn't necessarily need even your expertise. Now, there are times where God uses your ability, where God uses your pre-existing commitments and your talents, but there are also times when he asks you to set aside your ability and your pre-existing commitments. There are times where he works through your strengths, but there are times where he wants you to set your strengths aside because he wants you to see that he can do abundantly more through your weakness. And honestly, when was the last time you did this? When was the last time you felt God was leading you to make an inconvenient commitment, to set aside pre-existing commitments, to set aside your abilities for his name's sake? And what was your response? And again, there are times, many times, where God uses our pre-existing commitments and our hobbies and our talents, things like work, things like, whatever your specific gift is. But there are also times where he asks you to set those aside. But here's the problem. That's inconvenient. Anything outside of my commitment that I've already made is inconvenient. And, there are many reasons why, but there is actually a reason that I think of why God only uses a few people, and sometimes only ever uses one. Everyone else is too busy. Are you too busy? When God comes knocking, are you there? When he knocks on the door of your heart, are you too busy binge watching Netflix or YouTube or maybe absorbed by, the politics of another nation? Are you there? I was thinking about this slide and even this article I read, and we'll come back to it. Have we turned Christianity into a religion of convenience? And as I thought about all that and our cultural climate right now, I believe with my whole heart that God is up to something good in the GTA. I feel in my heart that he is going to move where despair and sorrow and loneliness abound. I believe that people will respond in an even greater way to the good news of his son, Jesus Christ. And I wouldn't be surprised if something significant happened. But church, here's a question for us. Would you like to be a part of it? Would you like this church to be a part of what God does in the GTA? Because if we want to be a part of it, we have to be careful that we don't let our commitments get away of experiencing a move of God. And I think really, sometimes commitment is a code word for priorities that we just don't really want to change. Now, don't misunderstand me. I think commitments are a very healthy decision. In fact, some contexts, some circumstances, some relationships need commitment before they need anything else. And so I'm a big believer in commitment and sticking to them. But I have found that it's not uncommon for people to use the verbiage associated with commitments to hold on to their priorities. For example, have you ever asked someone for help and they said, "Oh, I'm already committed. I would have helped you, but I'm just looking at my phone and my iPhone watch or whatever, and I can't help you that day," or "I'm just too busy," or "I can help, but this thing just came up." And look, I think there's a fine balance because you have to go to work. You have to have some level of hobbies in your life. You need to find a place in your life where you can play and have fun and be recharged. There is such a thing as healthy commitments, but do we ever take the verbiage associated with commitment and even use that in our faith? I mean, going back to that article I read, have we turned Christianity into a religion of convenience? I think even before COVID-19, commitment to the church has been waning for decades. And they say that crisis is an accelerant, that it accelerates pre-existing trends and the direction those trends are going in. And while there are always a few exceptions to the rule, I think churches across the world are realizing that commitment has been waning for a very long time. And I think there are two reasons why. I'm going to give you one reason now and one reason in a few minutes, but I think the first reason really is typified by these nobles of Tekoa, right? Who would not put their shoulders to the work. Now, in this town, Tekoa, it was the common people who made the inconvenient commitment, but not the nobles. And we're not even told why. And I think people then, in a lot of ways, are not all that different from people today. These people were nobles. They were wealthy and they were affluent. And I believe that wealth and affluence can be used by God for his kingdom, but sometimes the priorities associated with wealth and affluence can just as easily get in the way of God's plans for your life. Has that happened? Have you ever seen it happen? Is it happening right now in your life? Have we allowed wealth and affluence in the West to get in the way of greater faithfulness? And I think here's the tragic irony, that when we allow wealth and affluence to get in the way of what God wants to do in our lives, we're actually missing out on something bigger and better. But when God comes asking, what's the response? When he asks for something, does it feel like he's asking for everything? See, when something feels like everything, when God just asks for something, but you treat it as if he's asking for everything, then you're probably prioritizing the wrong things, because the road to rebuilding, the road to restoration, the road to even revival is paved with inconvenient commitment. So what now? What do I do? Do I just do things that I don't like doing? Do I just embrace inconvenience for the sake of inconvenience? Is that what God is asking me to do in this text? Is chapter 3 all about God ruining my fun and saying, look, you need to work harder and do a little bit more and embrace discomfort? No, I don't think that's what this chapter is all about at all. And I think it's because of that last verse we read, chapter 4, verse 6. When I read it, it was really meant to be read as a statement of excitement. Look at how far we've come. Isn't this great? But as I read it, I sensed the excitement of the Israelite people at that point in time. But at least for me, I was really bothered by what I read. And it made me wonder this. What if inconvenience isn't about your schedule? Like, what if it has nothing to do with your pre-existing commitments? What if inconvenience has nothing to do with your calendar? What if it's about your heart? I made a fairly significant mistake early on in my career in ministry. It wasn't a mistake of omission or commission, but rather it was a mistake that misdiagnosed people's heart position. And so many years ago, I was a young adults pastor in Hamilton, and we were just running out of volunteers. The ministry was growing, and we just needed more volunteers. And so, like most people, I just kind of Googled volunteer recruitment strategies. I talked to the rest of the staff, and we did our very best to recruit volunteers. And it worked, but not as well as I'd hoped. because, of that second reason, which I'm going to get to in a second. But one of the areas in which we really, really needed volunteers was bus drivers. We would send buses to the universities and colleges in town, and just we had a great response. But, for those of you who are a little older and maybe you remember bus ministry back in the day, bus ministry is a massive commitment because you have to come early, and because of the laws, you have to, do a bus check and whatnot and make sure everything's working. And, because churches are cheap, bus churches or buses that churches own typically don't work very well. And so it's a massive commitment. You got to come early, check everything, go pick them up, and then wait around for the service to be done and then drop them off at nighttime, but not after the service because, young adults like to congregate. And then oftentimes, again, because these were bus churches, they needed to be fixed regularly. And so it wasn't just a commitment to picking up and dropping young people off, but it was a commitment to not going to the mechanic because we couldn't afford that, but we would go to, one of the farmers who knew how to fix tractors, and we figured, hey, tractors can't be all that different from buses. And so it was a massive commitment that, we just needed people to make. And really, we had 2 or 3 people, but really one. We had one person who was just incredibly committed, and they would come 2-3 times a month. Even when they weren't on throughout the week, they were the farmer. They were the ones who were always fixing the buses, and they did it pro bono. And I remember, thinking to myself one time, like, why? Like, how in the world did I convince this older gentleman to give his time, his talent, and his treasure on a regular basis? And it really was this incredible commitment. In fact, I had, other pastors saying, maybe you need to tell this guy to slow down. And I did. And he said, no, pastor, I can't. We got to keep going. And I thought, like, why is this person, like, giving me this incredible commitment? And I remember it was one of these, Sunday night young adult services. And I was just kind of worshiping at the back, and he was there too. And he had just tears in his eyes. And I didn't realize it. You think as a pastor I would have figured this out, but again, it was early on in my ministry career. But he looked up, and I looked up, and on stage, I saw it was his grandson leading worship. There was 2 groups of grandkids that he had, and the one group went to church, but they had no relational connection, and yet through this ministry, those chunk of grandkids started coming out. But there was another group of grandkids, 4 boys, who either never believed or walked away. And that night, that particular ministry night, his one grandson, who I convinced to lead worship by tricking him, and it worked out beautifully. But he was leading worship. His 2 other grandsons were on the worship team. His other grandson was reading scripture, and they had all invited friends out. And really, what he saw was his legacy, his grandchildren coming to faith and embracing their faith. And it just, and he worshiped with these tears in his eyes because he just knew he had seen with his own eyes what God had done. It wasn't this, his faith wasn't this fantasy where God never shows up. No, he was watching God's faithfulness in his family. And so, when we read this chapter 4, verse 6, we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. It wasn't a commitment defined by an allotment of time. It was about hearts that were captivated by what God had already done. It's the reason why this elderly gentleman was so committed. His heart was captivated by what God had already done. It wasn't completed. I mean, these young people had a long way to go and a lot of ground to cover in terms of their faith as they lived faithfully for the rest of the years. But he had seen what God was doing, and he couldn't help but give his whole heart. Now, I mentioned kind of 2 reasons why this commitment thing is challenging, why sometimes it's hard for churches to get volunteers. And I think one reason why is that, Christianity has been turned into a religion of convenience by wealth and affluence. And look, I think God can use these things as well. But there is another reason that I think is a much more pertinent reason, the one that often goes undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. And it's this other reason that why I read this verse with both excitement, but also with a sense of despair, because I know this is the other reason that I think we're really missing in our culture. You can't work with all your heart if your heart hasn't been captivated by who God is and what he's done. You can't work with all your heart if your heart hasn't been captivated by the presence of God in this place, in your midst, whether it's in a church or in a living room or in the kitchen. I mean, is there a fire in your soul to see God continue the good work he started in your home? Is there a fire in your soul to see God continue the work he started in your community, in your workplace, in your school, even our church and this city? If the road to restoration, to even revival is paved with inconvenient commitment, are we so caught up by what God is doing that we choose to endure sacrificial commitment because we know what he's done? We've seen it, and we believe with our whole hearts that the best is yet to come. But what's interesting is that at this point, they were only halfway done. Remember, the wall only reached half its height. How do you keep going when you're only halfway done? How do you keep going when there's so much more ground to cover? How do you keep going when sometimes the commitment it's more than just inconvenient? It feels painful. It feels sacrificial. How do you really keep going? And so in closing, I wanted to share this one thought with you. And I think it summarizes chapter 3. And I think it's really another way of just rewording chapter 4, verse 6. It's easier to invest in what's to come when you're encouraged by what he's already done. It's easier to invest in what's to come when you're encouraged by what God has already done. But it begs the question, are we paying attention? Are you paying attention to what God is doing in your life and what he has done? If God can bring people from ruin to restoration, is my attention preoccupied with the ruins and the emotional debris? Maybe, just maybe, you and I are giving too much attention to the problems and emotions that are causing us apprehension. Because if God is still in the business of restoring people, do you believe that something better is coming? Do you believe that the best is still yet to come? Sure, we've seen his faithfulness in the past, but we're convinced his faithfulness is not a thing of the past, that he's faithful today. And he will continue to be faithful till the day we meet him and beyond. Sure, we've seen what he's done, but we believe with our whole hearts that the best is yet to come. And so when you look at your context, when you look at your marriage, when you look at your school, when you look at your work context, perhaps I'm sure God has moved in some capacity, but he's not done working. Even for us as a church, if you're visiting, we're building a brand new church facility at 1100 Canadian Place. And we're building not because, we need another building, we're not building because Canada needs another church. We're convinced that God has been faithful and that the best days of Heartland are yet to come. But there's something that you and I need to do. Before God shows up, you and I need to wake up. You and I need to recognize that God is on the move. And even though it may look like it's half done, even though it may look like it's incomplete, God is working in the unseen. And look, at some point in December, we are going to open the doors. We're going to open the gates to our brand new church facility. But it's not about the chairs. It's not about the bricks and the mortar. It's about his presence. We're going to open those doors and we're going to ask that the presence of God would fill that place and overflow. And it's our hope and prayer that his presence overflows to the community around us. But before all that happens, you and I have to wake up to the goodness of God and see what he's doing. He doesn't need me to give him all of my best talent or my best finances, my best whatever. He wants my heart. And so I'm inviting all of us as a church to believe like never before that great days are ahead. And even though it may feel like it's half done, even though there may seem like there's a lot of work to do, our God is in the business of bringing things that are ruined, half destroyed, and bringing them to restoration. And so, church, let's worship Let's pray. Let's believe for better days. Let's believe that despite the context we're in right now, that God is laying a foundation for a great future for us. And really by faith, we believe he's laying a foundation for an incredible move in the GTA. So church, let's worship and let's give him praise today.